good evening or afternoon, kind of depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's book talk about a better life for their children. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. So thank you so much for joining us today virtually, and we hope that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, and Speaking Up, Confronting Hate Speech. So if you are able to join us at the museum, you can learn more about those exhibitions on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. So if you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box. So not the chat, the Q&A. And we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So today we are so honored to be joined by Andrew Feiler. Andrew is a photographer and author and fifth-generation Georgian. He has helped create over a dozen community initiatives, serves on multiple not-for-profit boards, and is an active advisor to numerous elected officials and political candidates. He was named Book Photographer of the Year by Prix de la Photographie Paris in 2022, excuse my French, for a better life for their children. The book also won the Prix de la Photographie Paris 2022 Gold Medal for Documentary Book, as well as the International Photography Awards 2022 First Place for Documentary Book. It has been honored with the Bartour Photography Award, an Eric Hoffer Book Award, and a Book, Jacket, and Journal Award from the Association of University Presses. Photolucida named Feiler's Rosenwald School Images a 2020 Top 50 portfolio, and Photoville selected them for the 2020 edition of The Fence, an outdoor exhibition displayed internationally in 11 cities. His photographs have been instrumental in the campaign to create a new U.S. National Historic Park and inspired the composition of a symphony. His work has been featured in multiple publications, and his prints have been displayed in galleries and museums, including solo exhibitions at such venues as the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, and International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. His photographs are in public and private collections, including that of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Institution's National Portrait Gallery. So we have a very accomplished man with us today. That's not even everything. So please go on our website and read his entire bio. And you can buy A Better Life for Their Children at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Andrew.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you all for joining us. It's great to be with you. I am going to share my, before I share my screen, I'm going to start with two premises. The first premise is that the Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. It dramatically reshapes African-American educational attainment. It dramatically reshapes it trains the generation of leaders who become the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come. And it helps make possible, because of this educational foundation, it helps make the civil rights movement possible when it happens. In addition, but if this story remains hidden history, and its scope and sweep is largely unknown. The second premise is that the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, the collaboration, the friendship, is one of the earliest collaborations between Blacks and Jews in the cause that only later becomes known as civil rights. And there's a direct connection between that collaboration, that relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel with his white beard flowing, marching in the front lines with Dr. King, and who famously said that when he marched with Dr. King, it felt like his legs were praying. And what happened in Georgia on January 5th of 2021, where filmmaker John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock, having crisscrossed the state of Georgia for 2 months developing not just a political alliance, but a close personal friendship. And Georgia sends its first Jewish American and its first African American to the United States Senate. This is not a political statement, this is an historical statement. That relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. Now, I am going to share my screen. There we go. And I am going to start with a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. This is about an hour northwest of Atlanta. And Julius Rosenwald is born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. In fact, if you go to downtown Springfield today, there is a 4 square mile Lincoln Home National Historical Site where all the historic homes have been preserved. And across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. Peter Ascoli, the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald, told me the story that when he went down to this National Historic Site to research his biography of Julius Rosenwald, he was meeting with the superintendent in his office, and he said, "Do you happen to know where Julius Rosenwald's childhood home was?" And the superintendent said, "You're sitting in it." At the time, the Julius Rosenwald's childhood home was the offices of the superintendent. Now, at that time, there was not a plaque out in front of this home. Today, there is a plaque, and that plaque was placed there by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. The vision of this campaign is that there would be a visitor center in Chicago and Rosenwald schools in each of the 15 states. I serve on the advisory council of the campaign, and a legislation cleared Congress at the end of 2020 to require the National Parks system to do a special resources study, a feasibility study. That study came out last summer, this past summer. And just a few weeks ago, Senator Dick Durbin and several members of the House, including James Clyburn, introduced legislation that would create this National Historical Park. Now, whether that happens this session or not, when this happens, and it will happen, this will be shockingly the first component of the U.S. National Park System to honor a Jewish American. So Julius Rosenwald rises to become the president of Sears, Roebuck Company. They didn't have the term CEO back then. And with innovations like satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, he turned Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what only later becomes known as civil rights. And he is motivated by his Judaism. He sees America as a safe haven for anti-Semitism, and he sees that safe haven weakened by how America treats her African-American citizens. He says, "I believe in America, but I do not see how America can go forward if part of its people are left behind." This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs on the wall of the president's home at what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, goes to Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. Now, this is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. At the rededication ceremony, former students, former teachers, and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt. And it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. In fact, the photograph on the cover of my book is a photograph of the restored classroom inside the schoolhouse. And in the back left-hand corner, you can see this quilt hanging. Now, these two men met in 1911, May 18th, 1911. And you have to remember that 1911 is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks. With a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children, many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so in 1912, these two men create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. This is a photograph of students and teachers out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School in Jefferson County, Kentucky. That's around Louisville. And I want to talk about the structure of the program because there is genius in the structure of this program. They reach out to the Black communities of the South and they say, we want you to be a full partner in your progress. So if you will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, or labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate about creating Black-white dialogue as a vector for future progress, and these have to be public schools. So while we would welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. If you do those two things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now, think about this. The Black community has to contribute. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants in philanthropic history. The white school system has to participate. This is an early example of public-private partnership. Now, I want to digress for 1 second and tell you one thing about this image as a historical artifact. The program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on them. And Booker T. Washington has photographs made just like this of students and teachers out in front of their schools carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities. And he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved that he is committing to expanding the program. And these photographs, just like this, of these students and teachers out in front of the schools, continue to be made throughout the entire history of the program. They become part of the history of the program. They become part of the visual language of this program. All of my bodies of work prior to this body of work have been in color, but it's a recognition of the importance that these types of photographs had in this story that I decided to shoot this body of work entirely in black and white. And so they, having reached out to these Black communities, having reached out to the white school boards, the program begins in 1912 with the Lochapoka community having been the first community to raise that requiring matching fund for which they will create the very first Rosenwald School until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia, the last Rosenwald School. The program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states, and the results are transformative. Now, I want to pause for a second here to talk a little bit about my process, because my process is very research intensive. I read and I shoot and I shoot and I read, and the reading informs the shooting and the shooting informs the reading. And there are 100 Rosenwald schools listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I read 50 of those nomination forms. These are very thick historical documents. And the story I'm about to tell you comes from the National Register nomination form for the Eleanor Roosevelt School. In 1929, Franklin Roosevelt, not yet president, Meriwether County, by the way, is Warm Springs, Georgia. 1929, Franklin Roosevelt reaches out to the Rosenwald Fund, having seen a Rosenwald School in Meriwether County, and said, we need additional Rosenwald schools in Meriwether County. Well, it's 1929. The recession is setting in. The Depression is setting in. The Black community is unable to make its contribution. The white school system is unable to make its contribution, and so the idea languishes. In 1937, President Roosevelt calls up Edwin Rembry at the Rosenwald Fund and says, I'm ready for another school in Meriwether County. Well, the formal program actually ended in 1932. So from 1912 to 1932, they built 4,977 schools. And so Edwin Embry says to President Roosevelt, well, Mr. President, the program formally ended 5 years ago. But for you, Mr. President, we'll agree to make an exception. And so the Black community contributes, the white school system contributes, the Rosenwald Fund contributes, the WPA contributes. And the head of the WPA is in the Oval Office to report to President Roosevelt and who asks about the progress on this school. And the head of the WPA tells President Roosevelt that they're $1,000 short. And President Roosevelt in the Oval Office pulls out his checkbook and writes the $1,000 check that closes the gap that makes the school possible. And later that year, he presides over the dedication of this school. Now, you'll note that when I'm out and about shooting this work, there was a for sale sign in front of this school. When it closed in 1972, it was sold to a family in the cabinet business that bricked up the windows, and they used it for storage of materials. It was for sale back when I was shooting this work, and I'm happy to report that through the work of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, the schoolhouse has now been purchased, conservation easements have been attached to it, and it's been sold to a brother and sister team that are currently working to raise the funds to turn this schoolhouse into a community center and museum. Now, I said the results of this program were transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrate Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald schools. So as Sydney mentioned, I grew up in Georgia. I am a 5th generation Jewish Georgian. I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. And in 1995, I moved back to Atlanta. And for 25 years, I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis's. And so I reached out to Congressman Lewis and asked if he would write the introduction to this book. And he said to me, I'm not sure I'm comfortable writing the history of Rosenwald schools. I just know I went to school there. I said, Congressman, I will have an essay in this book. There would be 2 other essays by prominent African-American preservationists. We will have the history covered. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What role did education play in your life? And he said, oh, I can do that. And so it was on October 29th of 2019. I found myself in Congressman Lewis's Washington office with all of these photographs in the civil rights movement on the wall. It had been likened to a museum. His staff had reached out to me and said, can we do this in the Atlanta office? And somewhat boldly, I said no, because as a portrait, I wanted this to be in the Washington office because it was a statement of power and a statement of achievement. And so we were sitting around this round desk in the center of his office, working on this introduction. At the end, he slams his hand down on the table and he says, it's perfect, don't change a word. And he stood up and his jacket had been drooped behind the chair. And he put his jacket back on and it has this cancer awareness ribbon on his lapel. And he says, should I take the ribbon off? And I said, Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you, and that is the authentic you, leave it on. And it was exactly 2 months later, on December 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with a pancreatic cancer diagnosis that would take his life the next year. This is the last formal portrait that was made of Congressman Lewis. This is the Emy School in Hale County, Alabama, the oldest known surviving Rosenwald school, and a very rare example of one of the 2 first designs for Rosenwald schools. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until February of 2015, when I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who had originated the role of African-American heritage specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office, and the story shocked me. I'm a 5th generation Jewish Georgian. I've been a civic activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I've never heard of Rosenwald Schools? So I came home to this desk and I Googled Rosenwald Schools, and I found that while there were some academic books on the topic, there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I set out to do exactly that. And over the next 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states. Of the original 4,978 schools, only about 500 survive. Only about half of those have been restored. And I shot 105 of the surviving schools. And the result is this book and 2 traveling exhibitions. So I'm going to bring you inside the Emy School because I want to talk about the architectural guidelines that are laid out at the very beginning of the program. But to do that, I have to tell you about Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect. He happens to be the great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in public policy circles in Chicago and a principal advisor to President Obama during his entire tenure in the White House. Robert Robinson Taylor is hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee today, one of its itself a national historical site, many of the beautiful buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. And Robert Robinson Taylor leads the team of architects who lay out the architectural principles of the Rosenwald Schools, these large banks of 9 over 9 pane windows on the left here that are the signature architectural feature of Rosenwald Schools. That's to let in lots of light because these schoolhouses would not have originally had electricity. On the right, cloakrooms where dirty outer garments could be kept out of the education spaces and the education spaces kept cleaner. Brick chimneys so that the potbelly stoves that kept these spaces warm on colder days could be vented. And you look toward the back of the space, there's a room divider. That divider would have originally had in it a series of doors that could be closed off to separate the 2 education spaces or accordioned back to create a unified space as a community center for use outside of education hours. This is progressive era architecture in service to education. Now, this is what's actually known as a 1-teacher school. This is a 2-teacher school. The Hope School in Pomeria, South Carolina, James Hope, who was the state superintendent, education superintendent for South Carolina, was so committed to the Rosenwald Schools that every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald Schools. And the family all but donated. They actually sold for $5, which even back in 1926 was practically a donation. They sold for $5 the 2 acres of land for this schoolhouse. And in appreciation, the community named the schoolhouse after him. Well, when the schoolhouse closed in 1954, it fell into disrepair. And in the early 2000s, Ron Hope, the great nephew of James Hope, retired Army officer, career Army officer, retires back to Newberry County, South Carolina. And he says, I'm on a pension from the people of the United States, from the United States Army. What can I do to contribute? And he single-handedly restores this schoolhouse. If you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, you will find from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. This is a 2-teacher school. And this is a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Now, the architectural guidelines of the Rosenwald program was that the schoolhouses were to be modest. That was in part to save cost, but in part to avoid attracting the ire, otherwise known as arson, of the local white citizenry. But there was a more specific guideline that I call the no doodads rule, that there should be no cupolas. This little thing on top of the schoolhouse is a cupola. And the reason that they said that there should be no cupolas is that one of the architectural advisors of the Rosenwald Schools program believed that a cupola was derivative of church architecture, and that on a schoolhouse, it violated the separation of church and state. But this schoolhouse has a cupola. Remember, the African American community has to contribute. and they count cash, land, material, or labor. This community wanted a cupola, and they built a cupola. This is a physical, tangible example of African American community agency in Jim Crow 1920s Eastern North Carolina. Now, we've seen one teacher schools, two teacher schools, three teacher schools, these small white clapboard structures. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. It is from this schoolhouse that several members of the Little Rock Nine go on to integrate Little Rock Central, which is about a mile away. And if this schoolhouse looks vaguely familiar with its Art Deco architecture, it's because the architect of Dunbar is the architect of Little Rock Central. Now, I knew this was an extraordinary story. It was not clear to me from the beginning how you would tell it visually. And so I started shooting the outsides of these buildings, the 1 teacher schools, the 2 teacher schools, the 3 teacher schools, the brick buildings that come later. But when I found out that only half of the surviving structures were restored, I realized that the historic preservation imperative was a hugely important part of this story. And since many of these schoolhouses were small, they had to be adaptively reused because they had been outgrown as educational facilities long before. And to tell those stories, I had to get inside, and suddenly I needed permission. And it was in that process that I meet all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, and I bring their narratives into this broader story with portraits. This is inside the Pleasant Hill School in Cass County, Texas. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters. 3 of these women had parents who attended Rosenwald Schools. 3 of these women attended Rosenwald Schools. One of these women in the front row center, LaJoyce Flanagan, was a teacher in this schoolhouse. And when the schoolhouse closed and fell into disrepair, these women came together and started quilting. And they sold quilts to raise the funds to restore the schoolhouse and turn it back into the vibrant community center that it is today. This is inside the Lincoln School in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. Notice the pressed tin that covers all of the walls and ceilings. Another extraordinary example of African American community agency, this case 1926 Eastern Tennessee, and the pride that this community had in its schoolhouse. This particular schoolhouse, when it closed, was bought by a carpenter and used to store lumber. But a little while back, the community got together and purchased it and then turned it back into a community center. And this is the Denby School in Warwick County, Virginia. Beatrice Combs was a student in this schoolhouse. And when it closed, she and her husband purchased the schoolhouse and promptly got into a fight. He wanted to turn it into a bar. She said, "Over my dead body." And they rented it out to 2 families. It's a 2-teacher school, 1 in each classroom. And Beatrice Combs joined an evangelical church that was meeting in a strip mall. And in the words of her daughter, she accepted the Lord. And this church, they ended up deciding to rent the schoolhouse out to the church. The church thrives. You see they've added on to it. And Beatrice Combs was a member of this church for her entire life. She was an usher at the church. She was the secretary at the church. Now, part of my research into these schools, I had to figure out I had to go on Google Maps and often Google Street View when it was available in these rural areas and figure out which way the schoolhouse faced. Because if I was going to be there early in the morning, if the schoolhouse is facing east, I had to be there early in the morning or it would be in shadow unless there was clouds. If it faced west, I needed to be there in the afternoon unless there were clouds. Now, this particular day, this schoolhouse faces west. And so I knew I had to be there in the afternoon. And it was supposed to be no cloud cover at all in the morning, but about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there was supposed to be some cloud cover. And I'm in Washington, D.C. I have to be back in D.C. for a dinner that night. I have to leave at 3 o'clock to make it back to DC for this dinner. And I go down to where the schoolhouse is located. I get there early and I sit there with this bright, shiny sun and blue sky and lots of shadow. And lo and behold, about 1:30, the clouds start to come in. And it's about 5 minutes to 2. And I'm sitting across the street and I'm going to go and shoot the schoolhouse at about 2 o'clock. And right then, a van pulls up and parks right in front of the doorway of the modern church extension you see on the right side of this image. So I get in my car and I go across 6 lanes of traffic and I knock on the door. It's the pastor. And I tell him what I am here for, and he could not have been more gracious. He takes me inside, shows me around, including bringing me into the old schoolhouse, where the portrait of Beatrice Combs hangs above the doorway in what is now the Beatrice Combs Fellowship Hall. And when the museum show of this work debuted at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta, her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren all came down to see the exhibition. This is a portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the wall of the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee. Notice the shadow of these 9/9 pane windows that are the signature architectural feature of Rosenwald Schools. But as you can see, many of these schoolhouses are in great disrepair and at risk of collapse. This is the Hannah School in Newberry County, South Carolina, across the street from the Hannah AME Church, which is the namesake of the school. The church's graveyard has grown up around the school, and in the kind of detail that you could never make up. The schoolhouse rises on Deadfall Road. But you can see the schoolhouse is in terrible shape and at risk of falling apart. And when we lose places and spaces like this, we lose a piece of the American soul. They are the locuses of history and memory in our communities. And that's why this historic preservation imperative is such an essential part of this story. Indeed, there were times I came across schoolhouses that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by yellow caution tape or emergency fencing. This is the W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County, North Carolina, that had been demolished 1 week before I got there, just because it had become too unstable. Now, as I said, the people that I meet along the way are the heart and soul of this narrative. These are brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley. The photograph above the doorway of Julius Rosenwald has hung in that spot since this schoolhouse opened in 1923. This is the Cairo School in Sumner County, Tennessee. Brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley were both students in this school. They went on to college. They went on to graduate school. They both became educators. Frank became a high school math and science teacher. Charles became a middle school principal. And they have 4 sisters, all of whom went through this school, all of whom went to college. These 6 siblings had 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened were it not for this schoolhouse. This is the Bay Spring School in Forest County, Mississippi. This is the story of Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer Sr.'s grandfather had donated the 2 acres of land for the school. Vernon Damer was a student in this school. When the schoolhouse closed in 1958, the grandfather had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause, and it reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned the schoolhouse into a locus of civil rights activism. SNCC met here. The NAACP met here. And when Vernon Damer, who was the head of the NAACP in Forest County, Mississippi, when he drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to attempt to register to vote, he had them park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. Their son Dennis told me that on July 4th, in 1964, Freedom Summer, he was 11 years old. The family threw a picnic for the voter registration volunteers, black and white. At 11 years old, it was Dennis's first time seeing blacks and whites socialize together. But as you can imagine, all of this activism drew the attention and the ire of the KKK. And on the night of January 10th, 1966, Vernon Damer's home, which is right behind the trees to the right side of the schoolhouse, Vernon Damer's home was firebombed by the KKK. And he stood in the window of his home with a gun trying to hold the attackers off while his wife Ellie got their children out the back door. And Vernon Damer died as a result of his injuries in that fire. This is inside the Bay Spring School. This is Ellie Damer. Ellie Damer went to a different Rosenwald school in Mississippi. She went off to college and she came back and she taught in the Bay Spring School. But when the schoolhouse closed in 1958, because the state of Mississippi had built a new, larger, consolidated school for African Americans, note, 4 years after Brown v. Board, the state of Mississippi is building brand new, segregated schools. Ellie Damer was denied employment in 1958 at that new school because of her husband's activism, and she had to get a job in a school district 35 miles away. And she taught there for the next 21 years. This is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. At the time that I was out shooting this work, the schoolhouse was in the throes of its final restoration. I was back there in November of November 2022 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of this schoolhouse. That celebration was held partially in the school and partially in the old Bastrop Opera House. I have now made my operatic stage debut. And I'm going to tell you the story of the family that helped make this school possible. This is inside that schoolhouse. The portrait in the middle of this image is from the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin MacDonald. They were both born into slavery. And upon emancipation, they started raising farm animals. They acquired some land. They acquired some more land. They eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program came to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donated 2 acres of land for the school. One of its first teacher was their daughter. One of her first students was her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, on the left, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County, and they went off to college. They came back, had an entire career as educators in Bastrop County, and have been working to try to preserve this schoolhouse. And you see at the time that I'm out shooting this, the modeled texture on the wall, that's primer. There's plastic sheeting on the floor. The potbelly stove on the right is wrapped. This schoolhouse is now, as of November 2022, now a community center and small museum. I will add that there are 2 museum shows traveling of this work. One of them is at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, Virginia through April, and the other just opened this week at the Bullock, Texas History Museum in Austin, which is about 20 minutes from where this schoolhouse is located. And not only is this portrait there, my photograph, but the original portrait that's being held up here by Elroy and Sophia is part of the exhibition. So this is a book about Rosenwald Schools. But there's another component of Julius Rosenwald's legacy that was too important for me to leave out, and that was the Rosenwald Fellowships. From 1928 to 1948, these fellowships were granted to 278 white Southern liberals like newspaper editor Ralph McGill and playwright Lillian Smith. But it was mostly focused on African Americans, and 587 grants went to a who's who of 20th century African Americans, creatives, and intellectuals. Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, Zora Neale Hurston, Marion Smith. It is really an extraordinary, it's the largest source of philanthropic support for African American intellectuals and creatives in the 20th century. And Gordon Parks, the first African American photographer for Life magazine, was the first photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald grant. Now, Gordon Parks was long a hero of mine in the space of photography. It was through Gordon Parks that I learned that art could be a form of activism. I had the great privilege of spending some time with Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was on book tour for his memoir, Voices in the Mirror. And so I had this idea that I would I left out this little detail, which is that his daughter, Leslie Parks, here in Atlanta, Georgia, is a friend of my wife's and mine. And so I reached out to Leslie. I had this idea that I would do a portrait. I would use a portrait of her holding a photograph of her dad to tell the story. And she said, I reached out to Leslie and asked her what she thought of it. She said, this is a great idea. And she put me in touch with the Gordon Parks Foundation, and they immediately emailed me this self-portrait of Gordon Parks. And they said this self-portrait was part of Gordon Parks's application to the Rosenwald Fund. I said, that will do. And so they send me the photograph, and I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do this on a manhole cover, because one of Gordon Parks's seminal pieces of documentary was a photo essay that he did for Life magazine in 1952 that was a photo illustration of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and the Invisible Man is coming out of the manhole. And so that's the reference here. But I want to go back to one other important part in this narrative. Gordon Parks is, for his Rosenwald Fellowship, is placed with Roy Stryker's photographic unit inside the Farm Security Administration. Now, Roy Stryker and the photographers of the FSA are this giant and watershed moment in the history of documentary photography. These are photographers who are documenting not only the Great Recession, but then the progress of the federal programs. And it includes some extraordinary photographers. Dorothea Lange, her photograph of the migrant woman that is so iconic, was doing that for Roy Stryker and his team at the FSA. Carl Meidens, who wins a Pulitzer Prize for his photography in Vietnam, and Walker Evans were all photographers within the FSA. And so Gordon Parks is assigned to work for his Rosenwald Fellowship for Roy Stryker. And on the very first day, Roy Stryker says to him, go into downtown Washington, go to this department store and buy an overcoat. Gordon Parks goes down there, he goes into the store, and he is promptly thrown out. And he comes back and he is seething. And Roy Stryker says to him, shoot your anger. And soon he's working in the office late at night, and he sees this cleaning woman. Many of you will know the photograph. It's placed in front of a 48-star American flag with this cleaning woman holding a broom in one hand and a mop in the other, American Gothic. And Gordon Parks brings that image to Roy Stryker, who says, are you trying to get us fired? And he sits on that image. It actually does not appear for a number of years afterwards. But Gordon Parks, before he was doing this, he is doing portraits, photography on the south side of Chicago. Gordon Parks becomes Gordon Parks in part because of his placement in the Roy Stryker's FSA team. And so it is because of stories like this that I decided to write a short story that goes with each image in this book and in the exhibition, because I found Rosenwald Schools and other components of the story. I found Rosenwald Schools directly connected to the Trail of Tears, to the Tuskegee syphilis study, to the Tuskegee Airmen, to the litigation of Brown v. Board, embezzlement, murder. And so what I've done is I've written a short story that goes with each schoolhouse and with each image in each portrait, to collectively tell from beginning to end the narrative of this partnership between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, the role of this program from beginning to end, but also how each image and each story connects to the broader sweep of American history. So I'm going to close on a personal note. I come to this work as an activist. As Sydney said at the beginning, I've been very involved in the political life of my community. I've been very involved in the nonprofit life of my community. And I think about what this work says to me as somebody who is engaged in the work of community. And I think of two things. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington are building schools for African Americans in 1912 America, 1912 Jim Crow America, 1912 deeply segregated America. That is a deeply optimistic act. That is a multi-generational act. And I find great power in this combination of optimism and long ball. And indeed, for everything Congressman Lewis had been through, this was the heart of his philosophy. He would say with great frequency, be hopeful, be optimistic. Our work is not the work of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the work of a lifetime. And so I'll close this part of our program with a refrain of Congressman Lewis's most fervent call: be optimistic, think long term, and indeed make good trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this really amazing presentation, for sharing those really amazing stories with us, and those really inspirational words from Congressman Lewis to end us off. So we have a little bit of time for questions. So for those of you out there, feel free to continue putting questions into the chat. But I want to start with a question that came in about exactly what the Rosenwald Fund funded. So was it only the building of the schools, or did it fund for teachers as well and school supplies, things like that?
Yeah. So the short answer changes over time. If the so let's remember the black. So first of all, they are funding. Let's remember the Black community has to contribute.
Mhm.
The white school system is welcome to contribute. That actually also changes over time. But what Rosenwald is contributing toward in the early stages of the program are three things. They're building schoolhouses. They are sometimes building industrial shops for additional industrial education, what we would call VOTEC. There were some additional shops built next to these schoolhouses. And in some communities, he built teachers' homes, which, by the way, also were designed as spillover classroom space. And they're also built next to some of these schools. So those are the three types of structures that they're funding. But as time goes on, they realize that there are some other things that they need to incentivize. Sometimes in certain jurisdictions, the school year is too short. So they start incentivizing longer school terms. There are places where they really don't have enough books. So they create libraries. And in some cases, they actually then later in the program start funding school buses. But meanwhile, they are simultaneously investing in historically Black colleges to generate teachers for the schools.
Thank you. So another question that we had that came in was, are people able to contribute to the restoration of Rosenwald schools now? And if so, do you know how they can assist with that?
Yes. So there are a number of school restoration projects underway in different places. I try to post about those occasionally. In fact, I just found out today that there's a schoolhouse that's in my book that is shown in great disrepair that's just gotten a federal grant. That's in Montgomery County, Alabama. I try to post on that, but what I would you can also go to Google and look for schoolhouses that are in the process of being restored. And if there's a particular state or community that you're interested in, I would suggest you reach out to either your state equivalent of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. In Georgia, it's the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, or to your state historic. Every state has a state historic preservation office. And between those two organizations in each state, they should know which schools are in need of restoration or which restoration efforts are currently underway.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, was there any thoughts of expanding the program to other areas of the country outside of the South?
So the program was in the 11 states of the former Confederacy, plus 4 border states: Oklahoma, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. Missouri joined the program late, and so there were actually only 3 Rosenwald schools in Missouri, only one of which survives. Um, but by the end of the program, so in 1928, Julius Rosenwald is professionalizing his foundation, and he steps away as actually from leading it, and he hires a man named Edwin Embry, who was the vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation, where Julius Rosenwald was on the board. And Edwin Embry does a number of things that are innovative. He starts to incentivize brick construction because he realizes these schoolhouses are going to be around for a while. He works with Julius Rosenwald to create the Rosenwald Fellowships, but he also recognizes that these schoolhouses are going to be around for a while, and that they needed to pivot from focusing on building educational structures to focusing on educational outcomes. And that's when they start to pivot in their philanthropy to focus more on things like books, longer school term, buses, and more teachers coming out of HBCUs.
Thank you. So another question that we had, you mentioned that, how many communities arose around these schools and continue to be there. So can you talk about the reactions of the communities to your book and its publication?
So I just posted on, so I was just at this opening of the exhibition at the Bullock Museum, and Flo Stevenson, who is the leader of the Pleasant Hill Quilters. I showed her the portrait of the Pleasant Hill Quilters earlier. She came to the opening, and I just put it on social media today, my photograph of me and Flo Stevenson, who'd come all the way over from Cass County, which is in very East Texas, all the way over to Austin with some of her fellow quilters. And you'll just see in the photograph, she's beaming. And that it was illustrative, and she's just an absolutely lovely person. And that's really what I found. People were so grateful that I was here to tell their story. That education is such, and I'll tell you this one particular story. There's there of the Rosenwald schools that I went to. 105 Rosenwald schools, only 5 are still in use for educational purposes. One of them is the Plaisance School in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, which is an active elementary school because they've added on to it. And I had been there, and it's because of the way it's laid out, it's actually very difficult to photograph. And so I concluded that I needed to be there early one morning, and it was going to be a school day. So I figured, okay, I'm going to be out in front of an elementary school at 7 a.m. I better tell somebody I'm coming. And so I called up and introduced myself to the principal, and she said, fine. And so I get out there at 7 a.m. and I'm doing my photography thing. And about 9 o'clock, I'm done. And I decide to go in and introduce myself to the principal. And it turns out she actually knows a lot about Rosenwald schools. She had studied it. And this was a schoolhouse where 70% of the money came from the Black community, 30% came from Julius Rosenwald, and she marvels at that commitment. Because remember, the Black community is already being taxed to pay for white schools, and they had to dig deep to pay for this school. And she says to me, they worked and they strove and they did what they could to make a better life for their children, because in their eyes, education was liberation. The title of the book comes from that conversation, but that was emblematic of the reception that I got when I was out and about. And I'll add one other thing. There are 21 portraits in this book. Because some of them are group portraits, there are 47 people whose photograph appears in this book. 7 of them have since died, including Sophia Williams, shown in that last portrait inside the Hopewell School. Elroy Williams is still alive. He was at the opening this past week. But Sophia Williams died a couple years ago. And 7 of these folks, including Congressman Lewis, have passed away. And I kind of feel like I got to this story just in time. And I'm just so grateful that I was able to tell the story through the people who lived it and could share their experiences with me, and ultimately with each of you.
Yeah, I think we're very grateful as well. So kind of we have just a little bit more time. So I think what a lot of us are wondering is how can we follow your work and follow you on social media and kind of keep up with what you're doing next.
So I'm active on Instagram, despite the efforts of well, I'll just say, despite the efforts of Elon Musk to screw up Twitter, I happen to be a Twitter fan, so I'm active on Twitter. I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn, so you can follow me there. Where I am working on a new project, but I'm 2.5 years into it. Is probably a 5-year project, so it'll be a number of years before that comes out. But will also be image and story, history and contemporary issues. I've found that that's the space where I can uniquely contribute to photography. And so I'm going to stay in that vein of basically my work is really about using photographs to bring people into important stories in our history that they otherwise might not be able to access.
Amazing. And I saw somebody asked about Andrew's website. So the link that we use to for you to buy the book also links to Andrew's website, so you can find it there. And we'll also include it in our after program email.
Yeah, I'll just add, it is andrewfeiler.com. As opposed to the other Andrew Feiler, who was a photographer, shocking in the world of internet, which but he is a wildlife photographer based in Las Vegas. But my domain is andrewfeiler.com, and just for the ease of the museum, they asked to run the book sales through my website, and you'll see that I've turned off shipping charges because of this group for the next week or two. And you'll have the option of choosing not autographed, just autographed, or personalized, and I'm happy to do whichever of those you prefer.
Well, thank you so much. We are at the end of our time. So Andrew, I don't know if there's any final thoughts you want to leave us with, or if you feel good.
Well, I'll say one more thing, and that is, let's just remember 1912 America. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington are reaching across divides of race, of religion, of region, and they fundamentally transform this country for the better. And I think, at this moment in a very divided America, I think that there is a lesson here for all of us, that individual actions matter and that we change the world. And the change is us. And so I find great power in the accomplishments and actions of these two men at another treacherous time in our history. So I think this speaks to all of us to be the change. Thank you all very much for joining us.